Hey everybody, welcome to today's webcast. My name is Lee Fraser. I'm a Senior Technical Specialist for Autodesk, and we're going to take a look at using Paint Effects inside of Maya today. Hopefully at the end of this you'll have a useful understanding of what Paint Effects is inside of Maya. We're going to look at just the tool itself and just an overview of it, but we'll go through the basics and what's important in creating a brush and the different types of effects that Paint Effects can create inside of a Maya scene, as well as some ways of handling large amounts of data using Paint Effects. And we'll talk a little bit about rendering, and just essentially we'll wind up with an overview of the different types of things that you can do using Paint Effects that you might not be aware of. So that's what we're going to do today, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start off with just a brief overview and definition of what Paint Effects is. It's essentially just a brush-based tool that allows you to create 3D elements in your Maya scene. Of course, as you can see there, it also creates textures through the 2D part of its Paint Effects panel. It's pressure sensitive, so today we're going to be using a pressure sensitive Wacom tablet. Pressure sensitivity can drive different attributes within a Paint Effects stroke. It's very well integrated into the rest of Maya through its use of curves, so anything that a curve can be associated with can have a Paint Effects brush attached to it. It's also got a common interface with the rest of the brush-based tools inside of Maya. So if you're used to using the Sculpt Geometry tool or any of the painting tools, you're already familiar with the interface that Paint Effects uses. Paint Effects was created by Duncan Brinsmead, so I thought I'd give a little hat tip to him because he is not only the creator of Paint Effects that was, I guess, implemented in Maya just around 2.0, but he also has contributed greatly to the rest of the development of Maya and some unique portions of it. You can obviously Google his name, but I'll also attach a link to his blog at the end of the presentation. He's got a great bunch of tips and tricks on the area. The most obvious place to start off inside of Maya is with the interface. So we'll take a look at the Paint Effects panel, a little bit of the brush control, and where to find the visor, which is where all of our presets are kept. So here we are inside of Maya, and this is sort of the default view. I've gone ahead and brought up the Paint Effects shelf. The Paint Effects shelf is just one of the default shelves inside of Maya, and this gives you an easy to access place for a lot of Paint Effects preset brushes, so definitely take advantage of those. We'll also look at the visor, of course, but the shelf provides sort of a wide range of different types of brushes that we can look at. So the Paint Effects panel is accessed under the panel menu. We can go to Panel and hit the Paint Effects selection, or we can hit just the 8 key, and that will toggle between whatever view that we're in the Maya view and the Paint Effects panel. By default, you get just a 2D canvas view. If I click on my Paint Effects brush and start dragging in the interface, I get sort of that default black brush that you might see in any other paint program. It is pressure sensitive, so if I brush lightly, I get a smaller stroke. By holding down the B key, of course, we can change the size of the brush by dragging left and right. And just to clear everything out of the window, there's an erase button handily located on the panel shelf, and we can click that to clear it. Now if I go in and create something and hit Z, the Paint Effects stroke does not undo because there is only a single canvas undo, so that's something to keep in mind. The tiling within this is really useful, so if we wanted to create a tiled texture, let's just grab this orange pastel brush. We can go up to the canvas wrap and wrap this horizontally and vertically, which I've already selected. So as I travel from the left side of the screen, my stroke will travel over to the right, and same goes for top and bottom. So that's really useful when it comes to creating tiled textures. We can also create some interesting effects, and this is one of the unique things about the Paint Effects paint panel, or the 2D panel. And I can just drag across whatever paint that I happen to have, and this is a smear effect that just sort of dribbles down whatever color that I happen to have in my scene. And for creating textures that maybe rust on metal, any kind of obviously wet textures, this is really useful for creating that type of an effect. And it's just one of the more unique features of the 2D panel inside of Paint Effects. Smear can also be used in the 3D panel. Let's go ahead and clear this out, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other features of the 2D version of the Paint Effects panel. One thing to be aware of is the 2D panel is actually a 2.5D panel. So some of the brushes, like this hairbrush, have depth enabled on them. So if we look at the template settings for this particular brush, which we'll talk about in a bit, depth is actually turned on. And when I stroke in the canvas, this hairbrush has depth to it. So these curls that come off the center of the stroke are aware of the depth of within 2D. So it's sort of a 2.5D. What that means is if I go back with a stroke, say this gold brush, and drag along the canvas, you can see that it gets placed underneath the stroke. Same thing with something like a grass brush. Any stroke that sort of goes along after the fact can be sort of not really layered, but placed within sort of the depth of that particular stroke. So they can be useful for different texturing situations. Another thing that's nice is the ability to change the background color. So if we wanted to go to black or something in between, we can go and use brushes that would otherwise not show up on a white background, like our Galaxy brush here, or something that has a lot of glow to it, like this lightning brush. So that's just sort of a quick overview of the 2D or 2.5D version of the PaintFX panel. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the 3D version offers. I'll go ahead and clear my canvas. It's easy to get over to the 3D portion of the PaintFX panel. Just go up to the panel menu and tell Maya you want to paint within the scene. And what you get is the normal Maya viewport, but what's unique about this is that when you create a stroke within the scene, you get the 3D version and the rendered final output of what your PaintFX stroke is going to look like. So in this case, if I stroke directly in the viewport, I get a 3D representation, but this is exactly what it's going to look like in the final render. So this is something that can be useful for previewing what your PaintFX stroke is going to look like in your scene. Here's the Galaxy brush. So you can see that it does traverse through the scene. There's depth to it, obviously. So the thing to keep in mind here is that this is the rendered equivalent of what you would see in the Maya render, not Mental Ray. That's just something that as you go about creating these is important to keep in mind. The other workflow that we're going to talk about is obviously converting these to geometry and then creating an output from that. So that is a look at the 3D view inside of the PaintFX panel. Let's go back to the canvas view and talk about one last thing, which is the visor. If we go to the button here, and actually let's clear our canvas out to a white background so we can see a little better. We'll click on this brush icon. You can see that it says Get Brush, and what that does is it opens up the visor. And the visor is really useful for learning the types of brushes that can be created with PaintFX. There's hundreds of examples in here, and we'll talk about the attributes in a little bit, but you can see the different categories from airbrush, so typical paint type strokes, to something that's not anything like paint, which is fire. There is odd things like hairy arm flesh, and you can see again the 2.5D version of the PaintFX panel. Flowers, things like food, really odd kind of things. There's pretzels, there's pretzel sticks, and we've looked at the Galaxy brush. There's lots of different types of glass. We've got metals, so I really like the razor wire brush. There's objects, chess pieces, paper, so things like confetti are really useful in some cases. Different types of fiber for creating textures. There's plants, so things like ivy and oddly enough flowering peas. There's Toon outlines, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is really these are some really useful things for any kind of, again, textures and sort of graphic treatments. There's some background trees. In this case, those are really large. These are actually textured trees that are placed on cards. There's portions of trees. So in this case, we've just got some branches that would be useful for coming off of a larger portion of a brush. There's odd things like underwater type brushes, starfish, and you can see that these are, the way these are oriented are sort of sideways to the camera. I'll show you a way of controlling that in a little bit. Sea anemones, and then of course the wet on wet, which I showed you earlier, which are more of a texturing type effect. So that is just a quick overview of the types of things that you can get out of PaintFX. Keep in mind that all of these are driven by the exact same set of attributes, which we're going to go over next, at least right after we talk about the components or the underlying pieces that make up a PaintFX stroke. It's helpful to know that when you create a brush inside of a Maya scene, two things are created that help control the underlying shape and output of the paint effect stroke. A curve, which is hidden, and a stroke. So let's take a look at those inside of Maya and find out how we can make sure that we can use them to our advantage. The first thing that we want to do inside our Maya scene is reset our template brush. The paint effects menus are found under the rendering menus and then under the paint effects menu. In this case, we're just going to reset our template brush, and I'm going to go to my paint effects tool, and with my B key held down, I'm going to drag left and right to make a larger brush and then just stroke inside the scene. So you can see that we get a preview of the stroke that we've created. This is just the default paint effects brush. We have a little bit of pressure sensitivity along the length of the brush, as you can see. And what we want to do is take a look at the structure that makes up this paint effects brush. So I'm going to go to my outliner, and you can see here that there is an underlying curve that is hidden because it's light gray, and then the overall stroke. So the curve itself is going to define the shape, which is obvious because you can see as I dragged, the stroke got created. And if I go into wireframe by hitting the 4 key and hitting Shift H to hide the selected object, you can see the curve and the shape that it creates for the brush. In this case, I can hit the F8 key and go into component mode, and you can see that it's fairly dense. The individual CVs get stroked along the length of the curve based on a sample density. And in this case, we can move those around, but you can tell that's not very helpful. One thing we could do to control this is to use our soft select brush. You can see that that gives a much better result. Or another thing that we could do is go into our surfaces menu, and under the edit curves menu, we can rebuild this curve. So in this case, this curve has 84 spans, as you can see over in the attribute editor. If we want, we can change this to something a little more reasonable, like 12. And suddenly, when we go into component mode, we now have a little bit better control. Even if I turn off soft select, we have a little bit more gradual control over the shape of that curve. So that's just one way that you can use to edit a curve or edit the shape of a curve, which in turn results in an overall change in the shape of the stroke. It's great that we can create these curves using the brush tool, but another useful thing is being able to create the curve and then attach a paint effect stroke to it. So if we go to our create CV curve tool and just click inside of our scene and just create a curve in any shape that we want. If we go to our paint effects menu again, under curve utilities, there's a menu item that allows you to attach the current brush to the curve. And when I do that, you can see that we get the same stroke down the length of the curve, although in this case we don't have the settings for the pressure sensitivity because it just implies that the entire stroke accepts a single overall pressure sensitivity mapping. We'll take a look at that when we look at the stroke itself. But one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that anywhere a curve can be created, a paint effect stroke can be attached to it. So if we go and create a NURBS sphere, and we expand this out and right mouse button click with an isoparm. So this isoparm is essentially a curve. All we have to do is under our surfaces menu, tell Maya that we want to duplicate that surface curve, and then go back under our rendering menus, and under paint effects we can attach a brush to that curve. Now anytime that something happens to this particular shape, that stroke is going to go along for the ride. So that's a really useful thing to be able to attach a paint effect stroke to any individual NURBS curve inside of Maya. The next thing we'll talk about are strokes. The strokes are, along with the curves, the underlying parts of the paint effects brushes. So let's take a default paint effects brush, and I'm going to drag really slowly across the grid here. And then I'm going to create another stroke, and I'm going to stroke a little more quickly. And what I want you to notice is the sample density, or the information that goes into each one of these curves, is quite different. So the first stroke that I created really quickly, there are 170 spans that go into making up that stroke. And in the second one that was created really quickly, excuse me, the first one was slow. The second one that was created more quickly only has 69 spans. So it pays attention to the speed of at which I move my brush across the screen in order to create the amount of information for each stroke. So in this case, you can see if I select each one of these, look at the difference in the sample density, or in the overall information that makes up the resulting output. That becomes important when it comes to brushing on top of a surface to create your individual paint effect strokes or paint effects brushes. The cool thing about this is you can change this after the fact using the stroke attributes. So you can see that there are things like surface offset, which indicates how far it sits off the surface. Display quality becomes really important when it comes to creating dense brushes that may slow down your scene. But then what we were talking about here is the sample density, and I can change that after the fact. So if I draw my curve a little too quickly, I can increase the sample density and then balance that with some smoothing that will change the interpolation down the length. So those become important when it comes to describing maybe the quality of the curve. The inbounds are important when it comes to animating the curve down the length from the front or the back. And then of course we have the pressure scale, which defines how that pressure sits down the length of the stroke. So in this case we've just got a default value of 1, which we can change on a global scale, or if we want to vary that down the length, we can change it to 0 at the beginning and then quickly ramp up to a larger value at the end. And of course by default this gets mapped to transparency and scale, but of course we've got a list of different attributes that can control. And again, when we start talking about the brush attributes themselves, these will become a little more important, or when it comes to creating your own custom brushes, that might be something you want to control with pressure. So other than that, the other important thing about the stroke shape is the information about the geometry, or converting it to geometry. You can output quads or hard edges, and there's things on the poly limit which we'll talk about in a little while, but those are important to know that they live on the stroke shape. So that's just an overview of looking at sort of the underlying nodes that go into making up the overall brush description. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can describe our brush and what goes into actually making up all these cool effects inside of Maya. Now that we've looked at sort of the guts of a paint effect stroke, the curve and the stroke, let's take a look at the brush attributes and sort of the fun stuff that goes into making up what becomes ultimately a tree or a bush or a flower or some other strange paint effect stroke. The first thing we'll do is just create a paint effect stroke inside of our scene, and you can see we just get the default black stroke inside of our Maya scene, and next to the stroke shape we get our brush attributes. There are a large number of attributes that go into making up a paint effect stroke, and what I want to do is just kind of give you an overview of how they're organized, or how I like to think of them in terms of organization. This makes things a lot easier to find when it comes to changing the values of a lot of different values to a particular stroke. So the first section from the brush type all the way down to mesh sort of is an initialization of the stroke itself, and it kind of is more of a global set of controls that control the look of the stroke and the effect that you're creating. Below that, from shading all the way down to glows or glow, is how the stroke is going to look in a Maya render. So we haven't converted this to geometry yet, so if we click the render button, we would get a rendered output in the Maya render as an overlay of the rest of the scene. That's how the Maya or the paint effect strokes are rendered by default inside of Maya. From tubes down to flow animation, this is going to dictate how the stroke grows out of the curve and how it is animated down the length of the curve, or how it animates over time. Anything to do with the description of the growth of the stroke is going to be controlled from tubes on down. So that is sort of how I like to think of them in terms of organization. From there, there's a little bit more detail. So the shading down to glow, I tend to sort of, I don't mess with these a whole lot anymore, because I typically convert my paint effect strokes to geometry and then assign a shader after the fact. That being said, it is important to know that these can be useful in sort of a stylized effect type of render. So if I go to my camera and change the background to white, I'm going to delete this stroke, and we'll go to our paint effects menu and grab something like our Toon outlines. And I'm just going to create a couple of different strokes in the scene just to kind of illustrate the point. So there's some arrows, and I'm going to go to the paper and grab something like a confetti. These two brushes in particular I could see being really useful in any type of animation that is non-photoreal, so something that's not necessarily specific to a photorealistic or a physically accurate render like mental ray. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you've got mental ray set to be your default render and you go to try to render this, you're just going to get a default white background. If you go to Maya software, notice how fast those strokes render. So it's something to keep in mind as just sort of a trick in your back pocket, or a tool in your back pocket if you need an effect that renders quickly and can be treated as a separate layer, those are really useful. And while I'm on this particular stroke, let's look at the confetti brush, because the shading in this is pretty unique in terms of its randomization of color. The color here, you can see that is based on this color 2 and color 1. So if I turn this to black and white, we're not going to get a whole lot of variation, and even though we do have some hue randomization, there's a little bit going on there. We can see the value randomization can be controlled, but then as soon as we introduce a color into this color 1 and color 2, we get a much different result. We can control this hue randomization across the length of our strokes. That's just kind of a nice effect that is available inside that particular brush and allows me to show the tube shading. So the illumination can handle real lights or real lights inside of the Maya render, as well as fake and real shadows. That's important. Even if you're, this is also important if you're doing or using a stroke in the 2D canvas. These fake shadows will show up inside that view as well. And then of course there's the glow that shows up on things like the lightning and some of the neon tube brushes. So let's go ahead and delete those guys and talk about tubes themselves. Anytime we talk about tubes as it relates to a paint effect stroke, we're talking about anything that grows up out of the curve that we create. So if we start off with just another default paint effect stroke and we go to our brush attributes, you can see under the tubes section there's just a tube checkbox. And as soon as I click on the tubes checkbox, we get something very different than what we started with. So this is something that looks a little bit more like grass or sticking out of the ground. And to explain this a little bit more clearly, what we're going to do is work with just a single start tube. If I turn this to 1 and turn my tubes per step down to 0, we'll turn our randomization down to 0, we get our single lone tube sticking out of our curve. So this could be the start of anything. It could be the start of our tree, our bush, our flower. It could be, as you start to turn up things like the width values, you can start to see that we get a little bit larger shape. That could be anything that is not twig-like or organic. But let's start back up at the top here. The tubes per step just indicate how many tubes get created down the length of our stroke. There's a randomization, or you can have them stamped evenly or grow evenly out of the length of the stroke. The length min and max is, if you set it to 1 and 1, all of the stroke tubes will be the same length. And then of course we have the width values. So we can, if we wanted to create something like a trunk, you can see that we get a wide value at the bottom and a pointy value at the top, which is a smaller value. The length bias is going to bias this more towards the length, or in this case the width, if we turn the width bias up. And then the width scale is going to give us control over the shape down the length of the tube. Now in this case, one factor or attribute comes into play in describing this width scale or this shape a little bit better, and that's the segment. So as I start to increase this, the accuracy that I get in terms of the shape that I'm trying to create will be greater the more segments that I introduce. So these work hand in hand together. Let's go ahead and turn these down just a little bit so we don't have anything too irregular. From here, we want to maybe control the direction this grows out of our stroke, and that is the tube direction. We can pass this along the normal or along the path itself, and then you have control over the elevation. In this case, we're going to be pointing this to, if we say 0, 0, we'll point this roughly down the length of the path. And of course, it's not going to curl in this case, but we also can go along the normal, and this will point directly upwards with a value of 1 and 1. So that is just kind of a look at the tube and what you would get out of this. Now a couple of other factors or a couple of other attributes will have an impact on this. So under the mesh section, right now we're working with tube sections of 6. That's different than the tube segments down the length. This tube sections is around the circumference. So if I set this to something like 4, we wind up with essentially a box. So if we wanted to create something that was box-like in shape, that would be how we would go about doing that. And of course we can turn on end caps. If we go down and turn our width, our width value up at the top, and we change our end value little bit and then go back and set our end caps on, we do get an open and closed value at the top, or an open and closed box. So that's something to keep in mind because that can be very useful, especially as we start to introduce other things to our tube shape. From here, we'll talk about the growth that comes off of this tube and how we can start to create other shapes, and then we'll expand that and deconstruct a more complex brush and kind of wrap it all up so that you can create your own custom presets. So the next thing we want to do is create growth from this central tube that we've created. And just below all of the tube attributes is a section called growth. The nice thing about growth is it's, again, laid out in order. So branches, twigs, leaves, flowers, and buds have each of their independent control under branches, twigs, leaves, flowers, and buds. Very straightforward. The branches, as soon as we turn on that checkbox, that expands or allows us to control any of the different attributes associated with the branches. These are very similar in nature to the tubes, and actually what you'll find is that the branches, twigs, leaves, and flowers have very similar attributes in terms of things like the branch angle or the split angle, the branch depth. So the split max depth indicates, as you can see, how deep the branch splits, and as it gets deeper it starts branching off into more individual branches. I'm going to turn this down to a little bit smaller value because we're going to turn twigs on next. And twigs, as you can see, it's in this case a little bit long for what we're working with, but we can easily go in and change that by changing our twig length. We can change the number of twigs that go into each cluster and change things like the twist values, the different angles at which they branch away from the branches that they grow out of, and that of course you've got the twig length scale, which is very similar to the other graph widgets and some of the control that you have there. And then of course we can add leaves to all of those twigs. Now the leaves in this case again are very big, so we can go in and change the value there. We can change the length and then the width. And again, these are all fairly repetitive in nature, and before you know it we wind up with something that is maybe not the most advanced tree in the world, but you get the idea that they start to branch out from each other. So I think the next step that is useful is to break down a stroke or a custom brush that's already been created that may not look as organic, or may not be, the leaves may not be actual leaves, but they are a shape that is created with a leaf. And we'll break down one of those brushes and learn how we can create something other than organic plants. We'll go ahead and start a new scene. And up on the shelf there is a teapot, and this is about as far away from a normal sort of what I would consider an organic paint effects brush as you can get. It's something that's rigid in nature, and you can see that it looks nothing like twigs, branches, or leaves, or even tubes for that matter. But by looking at this we can start to break down how this is created and learn a little bit more about the tubes that we've got. So the first thing to know is that the main effect is a tube. If I turn this off, we only wind up with just what would be the brush stroke itself. If we turn this back on, we can start to sort of look at some of the values that we looked at earlier. We can create multiple versions of this if we want. We can introduce more or less segments, and you can see as we start to increase the segments, sometimes in places where you think you might get enough detail for the curve, it introduces more detail, which changes the shape in such a way that might not be desirable or might not be expected. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of how this segments value works along with the rest of your stroke. From here, the thing that's driving the shape of this mostly is just this width scale. You can see very clearly the profile of the teapot in this width scale value, and if I expand this up to its exploded view, you can see that there's the indentation for the side of the teacup, so we could go in and change that any way we want, or move that around in a different location. And from here, let's go down and see what's driving the handle and the spout. So instead of branches, what we wind up with is a leaf and a flower. So there's a single leaf growing out of the spout, so let's close up the branches and twigs section. And if you look at the profile of the leaf, you can see really clearly, once again, here is the spout that we've got for our teapot. So very simple and easy to understand, I think. And again, just being able to break this down makes it a little easier, I think, to learn. So we can turn off our leaf if we want. Another thing to keep in mind is that we can change where this leaf starts. So if we can change the length of it, of course the width and so forth, but the start is going to dictate where along the tube it sits. So that's another attribute that's kind of driving the look of this. Now let's go down to the flower section, because again, we wind up with our spout. There's the profile of this, and again, we have the overall control of the width of our spout, or excuse me, our handle, and the start value. So it's just one single start growth point at which we're choosing to place this particular appendage. So even though we're calling it a flower in this case, it's obviously not a flower. It's driving the look of something else that we choose to we're choosing to use. Here's the petal bend value. That's obviously driving the curl of the handle. And then we've got things like the petal curl itself, and this isn't going to drive a whole lot. It's basically bending around the length of this, so you're not going to see it a lot because it's round. And that's pretty much it. In terms of number of attributes each stroke has, we could obviously go all day on each individual attribute, but they're very well laid out, and I think that's what I wanted to get across, is because a lot of people that look at Paint Effects initially look at this long list of attributes and think, oh my gosh, where am I going to start? And I think once you understand the organization of the attributes that are enclosed and look at the ones that you really want to focus on, and the ones that are most important in terms of the shape and the output, it really becomes a lot more easy to grasp. So we've looked at sort of the structure and the output. Let's figure out how we can get this out to a render. So the first thing we want to do most of the time, I would imagine, is output this to mental ray. And to do that, we need to convert this to geometry. And to do that, all we have to do is go to the Modify menu, go down to Convert, and go to Paint Effects to Polygons. So we can set a poly limit here, so we can either increase or decrease the amount of polygons that are produced, and we can check this to be quad output. So once we hit Convert, we wind up with our mental ray renderable geometry. So some of the things we're going to talk about next are what happens when we get a little more complexity, when we get large numbers of either leaves or trees or grass or combinations of all of those. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to manage some of that, as well as how to get that out into a final render. So that's what we'll go to next. To start talking about Paint Effects rendering, the first thing we probably should take a look at is an actual render. So this is just a rendering of one of the default trees inside of Maya. You can get this brush out of the Visor. The only difference is this particular tree has been converted to geometry, and then mental ray shaders have been assigned to the trunk and the leaves. So from here, of course, we've just turned on flow animation, which we'll take a look at in a little bit, as well as tree turbulence to drive the animation of the tree. And you can see that we get a nice look from that. There's a couple of things that are going on that are a little bit different. I don't want to go in too deep into the rendering side of this, because I'll provide some resources that go into a little more depth at the end of the webinar, but the thing to get across is that you can achieve a greater realism through the use of the Maya Material X shader. So here we are inside of Maya, and I've got two things. I've got my tree that has the animation on it that came from the rendering that we saw just a second ago, and then we have what that particular tree is based on, and this is in its default state. So this is the oak autumn tree. This is in the Visor. It's one of the presets, and you can see that right away, just in the default viewport, that there's quite a bit of difference. One thing you'll notice is that the transparency map does show up in the default viewport for the Maya shader that gets created once this gets converted to geometry. It does not show up, however, on my MIX material shader. This is just something to keep in mind. It doesn't affect the render, but if you're trying to preview this, this is something that you have to kind of work around or just deal with in the viewport. For the default tree, if we wanted to get this to grow up out of the ground and also have some turbulence, you can go into the behavior section. There's a turbulence tab, and then we just turn on our tree wind. And if we hit play, you can see that we get a little bit of wind noise that drives the animation of the tree. And then if we wanted this to grow out of the ground, the settings that I used for the other animation or the other tree were just to set a flow speed of about 3, and we'll turn on our stroke and time clip. Now in this case you can see that it just grows up out of the ground and we get our animation. So it's that easy to set up sort of a growth of a tree. From here I just converted it to geometry just like we did in the last example, and we need to assign an MIX material shader to each one of the components, which are the leaves and the trunk. But in that case, we're still going to get this sort of repetitive leaf texture. And what I'm going to do, just because this would take a little bit too long to explain in this webcast, I want to show you the difference between this particular tree and this one in terms of the texture that's driving the leaves or the look of the leaves. If I select the leaf on this tree and we go into the UV texture editor, you can see that it's being driven by a single panel or a single shell that describes the leaf texture over the entire tree, and it's fairly low resolution, and it is again just based on a single leaf. However, the leaf texture on my rendered tree is driven by a series of separate panels, and I'll post a link to a really good Python script that is available online, and this just allows you to select the leaves on your tree and then convert this or extract a series of 4 tiles that you can then use to populate an image that you create in Photoshop or wherever you happen to create your imagery. So that is the difference between the actual layout of the textures. From there, the hypershade allows us to look also at some of the differences and some more complex effects that we can create with MIX material or a material inside of Maya. But in this case we get a better look and a little bit more control over the lighting with some of the MIX material shading qualities. You can drive things like ambient occlusion. There's a lot more control over refraction and reflection, and ultimately I've also turned this or driven this by a two-sided shader and then taken it out to a surface shader, which describes my ultimate look. Again, one of the other places I'll post a link to is Gnomons. They have a recent video series out on rendering paint effects, and it's very useful, and a lot of this was the look or the shading network that I have here is very similar to the one that they create in the DVDs that they offer. So definitely check that out. From here, what I want to talk about is managing the complexity of multiple trees, because in this case, it's great to be able to render this single tree. I'm going to go ahead and delete this other guy. But if I had a forest of trees, or if I wanted to at least maybe even create a previs where I had a forest, or not just a forest, but maybe several trees and then grass and other items that were created with Paint Effects geometry, this would become pretty unwieldy, and Maya starts to slow down. And just like any other scene where you have a lot of geometry, we need to have a mechanism to sort of control that, but also be able to render that out at the end. So let's take a look at managing some of the complexity of our Paint Effects strokes. One way of managing the complexity that's created by the geometry from Paint Effects strokes when it comes to rendering, which sort of tails off of the last topic, is to use mental ray render proxies. The Paint Effects strokes, once they're converted to geometry, can be output into an MI file and then referenced back in from a lower res piece of geometry, and at render time they get swapped out. So let's take a look at how that works. Let's take a look at how this works inside of Maya using a more complex Paint Effects stroke. In this case, I'm going to go to my Visor and grab one of the defaults that will create grapes for me. So in this case, I'll just expand the size of my brush, and I'm going to create a very simple stroke in the middle of my scene. We'll go ahead and turn off that grid so we don't have to look at that. And one thing you'll notice is that they're a little bit sparse. And remember, before, we can go ahead and control some of that complexity using the pressure settings on our stroke. So in this case, the pressure map is set to scale. I'm going to turn that off and just let those be as big as they would be without any information going into it. And from here, what I want to do is, first of all, convert this to geometry just like I've done in the past so that we can get it to render in mental ray. I'm going to go into my options and make sure quad output's turned on. We'll do that. That looks good. And now we have our grapes. So I could hit render and this would be fine just for this small bunch of grapes. But if I had a larger, more complex bunch of grapes that I wanted to use in my scene, I could export this as a .mi file, which is what I'm going to do, and then create a lower res version of this and use that, or point that lower res version to the file that I exported, and at render time it would swap those out. So this is how that works. I'm going to take the grapes here, and I'm going to go to my file menu and just export the selection. I'm going to, instead of exporting a Maya binary, I'm going to go down to mental ray and use that as my selection. We'll expand this out, and instead of the renderable scene, we're going to export this as an assembly file, a render proxy assembly file, and that's really all I need to do. I'm going to export the selection. We'll go out to my scenes. We'll just set this up as test grapes, or test grapes. That'll work. Hit export, and I'm set to go. The next thing I need to do is convert this to something that's lower resolution that will allow me to create multiples of these. And one problem that we've got is to create a little box for every one of these would be pretty prohibitive. We added a nice convert geometry to bounding box option in Maya 2012, but this is what it gives you. This is not really anything like grapes. So to take care of that, one thing we can do is just go into the polygon menus and do a complete separate, and it'll extract every one of those grapes into individual objects. Then we can select these guys and run that command one more time, and then we wind up with a small little bounding box for every one of our grapes, and that looks a little bit more better as a representation of our bounding box. So then from there I can just select these guys, we can combine those, and then we'll delete the history, and we now have something lightweight that we can maneuver around our scene. So from here, if we look over into the attribute editor, you can see under the mental ray section, actually under the polysurface shape, there is a render proxy that just allows me to go out and navigate to my scenes directory where I exported that test grapes before, and now it's ready to render. So when I hit the render button, I now get my grapes instead of my bounding box. So it's that simple to set up. And just to kind of give you an idea, I've got a larger bunch of grapes here, and in this case this is a single paint effect stroke, and you can see it's pretty heavy just to navigate around. So using that same technique, we can extract a much lower res version of this, and you can see that we have it's very lightweight, it's a single piece of geometry, and it's a little better in terms of representation for a low res version of the grapes than what we had before. And same thing goes here. All we have to do is hit render, and it doesn't take very long, and we get our grapes render. So that's how easy it is to set up mental ray proxies for this. From here, of course, we can easily increase the complexity further. But what if we want to see a higher res version of this? We've added some controls in Maya 2013, the extension release, that give you control over multiple representations of a piece of geometry or an object in your scene that allows you to manage the complexity a little bit better. So let's take a look at that. Assembly definition was introduced in the last extension release of Maya and allows you to create multiple representations of any object in your scene. In this case, what we're going to do is use an assembly definition that is a mental ray proxy object and populate our scene with a large volume of the grapes that we used earlier. We'll go ahead and build out an assembly definition inside of Maya. It's really easy to do. We just need to go to the create menu and tell Maya we want to create an assembly definition. By default, we get a locator, and this is what represents by default the assembly definition, and the setup for it is located in the attribute editor. So you can see that the active representation is now locator. We can change that name if we want. In this case, we'll work with the grapes that we had earlier. So if I give that a proper name, it now shows up as the active representation. It makes it a little easier to locate in my scene. The next thing I want to do is add a representation for the scene. So I'm just going to go out and grab just the full scene so we'll know what we're working with. And in this case, you can see we've got our grapes. And this would be great if we're just working with a simple scene. We could go out and maybe add a cache representation for the bounding box, or excuse me, not a bounding box, but a lower, lighter version of our objects that we have here. But what I want to do is make this renderable, and so I'm going to add another scene representation. You can have multiple scenes represent a single object in this case. So I'm going to grab my bounding box, and this is the one that we used earlier. And if we look under the mental ray section, you can see this brings in or references my render proxy. And if I hit the render button, you can see that when I select the mental ray renderer with the render button hit, of course now I get my version, or my proper rendered version, or the proxy version of the higher resolution object. So this is a great way of populating your entire scene with something. So in this case, if I select my assembly definition, we can duplicate this object, move it around, do some different things to it, and this is a quick way of populating our scene with several different objects that we might want to render without having to manage the complexity of all those different grapes. So that's just a really nice way of using scene assembly in conjunction with render proxies as a way of managing some of the complex nature of what gets output from Paint Effect strokes. Another tool in terms of working with complexity in a Maya scene that doesn't necessarily have to deal with Paint Effect strokes, but it happens to work really well with them, is the use of pipeline GPU caching. So under the pipeline cache menu, there's a GPU cache option that allows you to import GPU caches, and in this case I've exported the grapes that we were working with earlier, and you can see that the speed of the scene just increases dramatically. So this can be used as another representation with scene assembly, and just gives you another tool in terms of dealing with the complex nature of Paint Effects geometry. This is something that you could fly a camera through without having to worry about whether or not you're looking at the right thing because of low resolution geometry in terms of the bounding box or not. And then of course we could swap this out to a bounding box version that references the high-res version like we did earlier, and you would have something that you could not only look at in its full resolution but then render in a much more manageable way as well. So that is GPU caching. As we saw earlier, there's a large number of attributes associated with each Paint Effects stroke. Inside the Paint Effects menus, there's already a mesh quality attribute which parses down some of the key controls for each stroke. But another way of managing the complexity of all of these strokes is to go through some custom scripts that are included in bonus tools. One of those is Attribute Collection. Another is the Attribute Template Editor. We're going to take a look at the Attribute Collection script today, just due to time, and hopefully give you another way of just managing some of the complex nature of the number of attributes on any given stroke. So here we are inside of Maya, and you can see that I've got just 2 strokes in my scene, but the idea is that obviously this could be 20 strokes. And what I want to do is present myself with some controls that are a little more refined than what the attribute editor does or gives me by default. So one way of doing that is going under the Paint Effects menu and pulling up the mesh quality attributes. And whatever stroke is selected, it presents you with the attributes that are key that we mentioned earlier into making up the actual segments of that stroke. And you can see we can simplify this pretty easily just by dragging the slider back and forth, as you might expect. We can simplify this down, and you can see, just like we mentioned earlier, the segments are really key in making up the look of a stroke. So having these controls at sort of a surface level becomes really important. So let's turn that down just a little bit. That'll work. And of course, like I said, this works on whatever happens to be selected, and if that particular stroke doesn't have the attributes turned on or the growth section turned on, those particular attributes won't be displayed. Another way of controlling sort of the complexity of attributes that are presented, not just on Paint Effects strokes, but any set of items in your scene, is through a bonus tool script or set of scripts called Attribute Collection. Now in this particular case, I've already gone ahead and added a couple of controls for the strokes that I have in my scene, and let's take a look at how those work. So over here you can see that this layout gets saved with the scene, which is pretty nice. And what I've done is I've just taken the tulips dynamic properties that I'm interested in this particular scene and thrown them into a group. So we can turn off the turbulence in this particular case, and we can either animate or play around with the gravity that goes into the stroke. So if I want these to be a little more droopy, we can do that, and then go back and turn on grass wind, and if we hit play, you can see that we get a result. If I don't like that, of course we can turn that off and continue working. So the way the attributes get added into the attribute collection script is really easy. All we have to do is grab the stroke that we're interested in this case, this is the mica cap or the mushroom brush, and by going to the channel box, we can select whatever attribute that we happen to be interested in. So in this case, I'm going to go down to, I don't know, let's turn on something like, we'll turn on gravity for this one as well. And then all we have to do is add the attribute to the particular group that we've got selected. So in this case, it's mushrooms, and you can see now I get gravity. Now in this case, gravity may not be a particular meaningful attribute to edit. Maybe I want to match these together, so I want those to be the same. So instead of the dot gravity attribute, let's edit that to be just gravity. We'll delete that, hit close, and now that becomes the new name for that attribute. Same thing with any of the others. If I want to edit the length min, I can call this maybe short. We'll hit close, and now that becomes short. So this is really a nice way of working. And in this case, one other thing we could do is select both of these items and add those to a new group. That would allow us to maybe combine two of the attributes together into drive. Maybe there's custom attributes that we want to control both of these strokes with, or maybe we want a global control to control 10 or 20 different strokes at once just with a single slider. This is a really useful tool for, again, organizing complexity and just sort of managing complexity of not just paint effects, but they could be groups of lights, groups of cameras, they could be shader attributes, anything that you can select in Maya. We can create groups and collections of attributes. That's why it's called Attribute Collection inside your scene. So this was written by Roland Dreyer. He's got a blog on the area, and I believe he might even have some videos on some other ways of using this. So definitely check that out. One other tool is that we won't have time enough to go into today, but I definitely would recommend you check out Stephen Rozel's blog, is the Attribute Editor Template Builder. This is just another way of sort of organizing attributes together inside your scene. And so that is just sort of a soup to nuts way of giving you just some ideas of how to manage some of the complexity inside your scene using paint effects. In this final section, I want to continue looking at some of the tools within paint effects, but also take a look at some of the diverse effects that you can generate using some of these tools. So in terms of effects that aren't typically associated with organic output like trees and plants, we'll start off with some motion graphics examples. We'll start off with a really geometric type shape that has a Toon outline associated with it. In this case, you can see that there's a black outline around my shape. And this is just a single tube with branches turned on. And one of the things I wanted to talk about here is not just the modifiers, but also the fact that, of course, we can animate this down the length of our stroke. And you can see that we do have this end time set to be kind of low, so let's make sure that that doesn't dissipate. But the last thing I wanted to do with this stroke is turn on gap sizes, and this is something that's pretty interesting because you can change the gap spacing, you can change the size, and what you wind up with is a way of generating really interesting sort of geometric patterns with an animation. So you can see that we get some pretty cool effects there. Let's turn the size down just a little bit so we can see these better, and we're going to create a modifier for our stroke. So I'm going to go up to my stroke and select that, and under the Paint Effects menu, create a modifier. And the modifier is just a little implicit sphere, and if we scale this up, you can see what it does to our stroke or our paint effects brush. It also affects the Toon outline because it's being driven by the shape. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about here. So first of all, the modifier is just a great way of getting some really cool effects. We can add noise in here, so as we start to move this around, you can see that the lines pulsate a little bit. We can change the frequency, and as I move this up and down, you get some really cool effects. This drop-off curve will affect the entire stroke depending on where we, what we set this value to. So there's a lot of control over what you can do. If this were a regular paint effect stroke, you could have it affect things like force, and of course there is force implied on this particular stroke, so you can get it to do some kind of crazy things. But if it were a tree, it would make more sense. You could see it blow back and forth a little bit more violently. You can obviously change the tube scale with this. If there were leaves, we could do that, and so forth. So the modifier is a really powerful tool in creating some interesting effects. The other thing to mention about this is that this Toon outline can have another paint effects stroke associated with it. If you go under the Toon menu, there is an assigned paint effects brush to Toon outline or Toon lines that will swap out the default black line for one of the other strokes that we saw earlier, like the arrows or some of the more brush type effects or anything that, for that matter. So that is sort of a look at the two. One thing that you can do is layer these. So if we wanted another outline or modifier rather, we could have one Toon modifier or one modifier on the Toon outline and one on the geometry or the paint effect stroke. And there's some other things that we can do here. We can extend these lines if we want. You can see that it sort of expands these lines as sort of an interesting way. As we come into contact with those, we get some line extension. We also have a line or surface offset. So as these guys start to deviate or as they cross my paint effect stroke, the Toon outline will sort of deviate from that stroke. So you can get some really cool effects with this, to be sure. So let's take a look at sort of a finished example. Here's one with just an animation, and I'll scrub through this really quickly. In this case, I've just got a grid of lines that are all sharing one brush. So under the Paint Effects menu, you can actually share one brush. So if you have multiple strokes, driving the animation with, or driving the look with a single stroke is really useful as well. Again, just sort of reducing the complexity. And you can see that we get sort of an interesting type of an effect from the modifier just by changing the scale and the surface offset. Really quickly, here's another example with a modifier and with noise turned on. So you can see that I've got the noise frequency turned up a little bit, and as I either change the noise frequency or change the location of the modifier, and you can see my drop off is set pretty high, I get a little bit of a wiggly animation, which is appropriate for this particular example. In this example, you can see that I've passed some attributes into attribute collection once again. And in this case, I just have a min clip set. It could be max clip, min clip, either one. And this just traverses the paint effects effect down the length of a curve. Of course, those curves could be driven alternatively with blend shapes, and you could change the shape and they could do create other types of animation, but this is just, again, something that's sort of non-organic in nature. This particular example is pretty fun. This is either a train track, a roller coaster, or could be a ladder that's a little bit crazy. And in this case, we get a couple of things. We get control over the curve because it's just a single curve instead of a paint effects stroke, rather, or at least one that's created with a brush. We can do all the things that we did earlier. In this case, I've locked the length of this. If I go under my Edit Curves menu and under the Modify Curves, unlock the length, you can see I get a little bit more control, and if we wanted to, we could easily go in and change this from 16 spans to something a little bit more detailed by just saying rebuild curve, and we'll set this to something like 22. And when we do that, notice some of these sections will smooth out a little bit, so we get more detail for the distance of the track. So if we pull it into a section or into a location that is a little bit sort of crazy, that would allow us to control that particular aspect of it. So from here, we also have each individual rung, and this is controlled by not just one stroke, but three. So each rung has its own set of attributes, and then the stroke that's down the middle has its own set. So there's lots of animation possibilities using something like this. But then one of the cool things about the center portion of it is that we've just got gaps size turned on and the gap spacing that we looked at earlier. And then of course the tube sections indicates the sort of detail in the middle. And then if we want to, we can look at the twist, because this is driving the other section of it. By default, this twist rate and this twist rand is set to 1. So take a look at that. This, I think, could be probably set down into the tube section, but that's just my opinion. One thing about each one of these rails, of course, this is being driven by the tube sections, and that gives it that square look. So I thought that was a pretty cool way of using several paint effect strokes together. And of course, you could obviously drive that into a single set of controls using the attribute collection like we did earlier. So that is just another example. This last example is kind of fun. This is just another way that shows how well integrated Paint Effects is into the rest of Maya. So we're using curves around a character in this case. So you can see that the character is skinned, and if I move the arm, obviously it goes along for the ride. And if we hide the character's geometry, you can see that the curves are also skinned in with the rest of the character. So whatever the curves or whatever the character does, obviously the curves do. So if we go back and play the animation, the curves go along for the ride. So I'm going to turn off my joints. So now we just have our character moving along the way you would expect. And what we've done is we've taken paint effect strokes and passed those down the curve. So here's the result. And in this case, we're using the intestinal flow brush. The intestinal flow brush is just kind of a fun way of creating some intestines. And you can see as the character stops here that the intestines just sort of continue to flow along for the ride. So there's all kinds of possibilities here. You could continue to maybe add dynamics to the curves and they would sort of jiggle kind of in an interesting way, and what you wind up with is just kind of an intestinal monster, which is pretty cool. So again, just another fun way of using paint effects that you might not expect. So that is by no means an exhaustive look at paint effects. There are just tons of things that you can continue to do, and this class is based on a class that was much longer at Autodesk University. So I will continue to post various bits and pieces of that class on my blog. You can see the last resource link there is to the blog on the area that I have. It's called Swedish, and the other resources that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Duncan's blog is also on the area, and then of course you've got Gnomon Workshop and Digital Tutors, which are also great learning resources for just basics of things like paint effects or any other thing that you might want to learn on some of the Autodesk products that we offer. So thank you guys for spending the time with us. Hopefully that was informative to you and you got some new ideas that you can use in your own productions. I'll leave you with a bacon tree, one of the other brushes that hopefully I'll get a chance to post on my blog in the near future. So again, thanks for spending some time with us, and we'll see you next time.